Good day, everybody, and welcome to another Mindset Mastery. Today, we're going to talk about one of, I'll say, my favorite subjects, which is self management. Absolutely wonderful topic to talk about. It is the number one competency of all highly successful people. I love to talk about it, love to get deep into it. We're going to have a lot of things to cover today, so let's jump into it quite quickly. So again, what we're going to be talking about today is self-management, specifically the principles of self-management, and what does it take to become a self-managed individual. As I said, one of my favorite topics to talk about, and simply because of this. If you sat and thought about this one particular question, how would you answer it as you're watching this presentation, whether live now or when it's recorded and up on our dashboard? And that is, do you agree that winners act on their own authority? If you looked at everybody in your life that you would consider to be a winner, people that quote unquote win at life, and you would consider them to be a winner, would you say that they act on their own authority? The overwhelming majority of the answer that I've got to that question in my career, and I've asked it 1,000 times, is yes. Most people believe that winners do act on their own authority. Okay, so let's look at that. What do people need to become winners? What do people do that helps them win? What do winners look like? If you boil that all down to one, I'll say one simple question. It's as simple as this. The number one competency for all highly successful people is self-management. They manage themselves day in, day out. They take 100% responsibility for themselves, and they manage themselves to success. They manage themselves into winners, and therefore they act on their own authority. Here's the challenge, or here's what I'll say some of the issues that I've found working with quote unquote individuals over the last 30, 35 years who either have become what I'll call self-managed and self-motivated, you might also say, or who are wanting to get there. Very few people have ever been exposed to what I'll say these principles that we're going to walk you through today, and they're left to chance. And in a lot of cases, I'll say the way they were brought up, the way they were raised, the way they went through adolescence, the way they went through their early 20s and 30s was a way of not self-managing themselves and, quite frankly, releasing or relinquishing their responsibility to self-manage themselves. Okay. The moment you start to take 100% responsibility for managing yourself and therefore the results that get produced from that, that's when the magic really starts to happen. Okay. And here's what I like to say to people when sometimes people have a hard time with that concept. And they go, well, geez, I don't want to take 100% responsibility for myself. Well, whose life is it? In this case, this is my life. In your case, it's your life. Who do you want directing that life? Who do you want directing what direction it's going to go in? Who do you want directing what I'll say the decisions that you're going to make in your life? If you're not prepared to take 100% responsibility for you and your life, in a sense, then you're giving up that choice. You're giving up that responsibility to other people. And I like to say, you might not like the choice that they make for you. And then the conflict ensues, then the frustration incurs, and we start to get blaming each other and things of that nature. None of it works. So let's talk about self-management as we dive into it today. And I've got a number of what I'll say slides that I'm going to walk you through. So we're going to be moving what I'll say a fairly good pace from that point of view. And hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation. Well, I know you will because I absolutely love it. Okay, perfect. Self-management system. Self-management system builds on our strengths. A self-management system does not focus on our, what I'll say, growth opportunities, because I don't like to use the word weaknesses. A lot of times people talk about our strengths and our weaknesses. I like to talk about our strengths and our growth opportunities. So any kind of self-management system that you're going to develop for yourself, and we'll walk through how to do that a little later on in our presentation, builds on our strengths. You want to focus on your strengths, and I'll talk about that a little later on as well too. Let's go back to the 80s, depending on how old the people are that are listening in and the people that are going to be watching this later. But I'm sure everybody knows Wayne Gretzky. That's a pretty popular name from that point of view. If we went back to the early 80s, mid 80s, when Wayne Gretzky and the Oilers were making their run for their cup, And we talked to what I'll say, Glenn Sather, who was the coach, i.e., the mastermind of that organization back then, who really understood self management and he really understood performance, which are another two key things. And he went to Wayne Gretzky and said, geez, Wayne, you're a heck of an offensive hockey player. Like, man, you're one of the best. Your defense sucks, though. You're very weak on defense. Let's focus on your quote unquote weaknesses and get you to become a better defensive hockey player. I would have accomplished one thing, or back then, Glenn Sather would have accomplished one thing, and that would have been to pull Wayne Gretzky's strengths down so that he wouldn't have been the offensive player that he was. Because when we focus on, quote unquote, our growth opportunities without focusing on our strengths, one, that's a really tough slug. That's like running uphill in wet concrete with snowshoes on. And the chance that we're going to get significant improvement there is very little. Yet, from that perspective, what we're also going to do is, because we're focusing on our growth opportunities, we're not going to be focusing on our strengths, and our strengths will recede back. Okay. A little bit of a funny joke I always like to say. What do you get when you line up 50 rabbits in a row and you ask them to jump backwards? A receding hairline. We're going to focus on somebody's growth opportunities and not focus on their strengths. All we're going to do is to get their strengths to recede. Let's focus on strengths. And we'll go through why that is so critical in the beginning or in the presentation. You want to be clear, though. Focus on and build on your strengths that improves performance. We've talked about the performance, so I'm not going to go into performance equation today, but your performance is simply the output of your talents times your habits times the opportunity that you're working. I'll say that again for people who are watching this for the first time and weren't with us when we went through the performance equation. Again, performance is your talent times your habits times the opportunity that you're working towards for your output. So you always want to focus on strengths that improves and builds the performance that you want. The benefits of doing this is simply, it improves personal effectiveness. You become much more efficient and effective no matter what you do through self-management. Okay. Very much recognizes high performance and it turns potential into performance.
On a scale of 1 to 5, would you give yourself a 5 on achieving what you want in life? If your answer is anything less than a 5, right now, I have something awesome for you. Achieving your goals and living your life at a 5 isn't easy. Most people aren't prepared to focus, stay disciplined, and do the everyday work that is necessary to achieve amazing results. But since you're watching this, then I'm guessing that you're not one of those people. And this is an opportunity that will change your life. Give to Get is a global program that brings together world-class coaching and combines it with empowering masterminds and networking opportunities. We provide 5-star guidance for the price of a cup of coffee a day. To find out more, click on the link in the description of this coaching session.
I've seen a lot of people in my career, and I've worked with a lot of people in my career who've gotten very frustrated because either they've been working with high potential people that it doesn't get turned into performance, or they themselves have high potential and they've struggled to turn that into performance. So again, by focusing on self-management, you start to turn that that potential into performance. Okay. The other thing, it focuses on the controllables rather than the non-controllables. Let's focus on what we can control as individuals, and let's let go of everything else that we can't control, which is pretty much everything else except ourselves. But when we focus on ourselves and we start to control ourselves, I'm just going to stand up here because my knee from my surgery a few months ago is starting to bother me a little bit. So I'm going to stand up and give my knee a little bit of a break. If we focus on the controllables and truly let go of the non-controllables, it's absolutely amazing what we can, start to control. A whole lot more than you thought. Okay. Anything to do with self-management starts inside out. Life is an inside out job, not an outside in job. And there's a lot of us who are walking around, frustrated, unhappy, not having the success we want, not performing the way we want. And one of the big parts is because we're looking at life outside in rather than inside out. starts with us, starts with our own commitment, our own, what I'll say, self commitment, in this case, our own self commitment to self manage. When you start to focus on managing yourself and going through the system that I'm going to walk you through here in the next little bit, it starts to build a self confidence through awareness of what your strengths are. And it rewards good effort and performance. And so, the more that we can start to, what I'll say, reinforce and build our self confidence, because when we are self confidence, that's when we are at our best. So, that's at the core where you want to start to self manage yourself. You're going to start to what I'll say, build your own self confidence. It empowers, where we talked about it earlier today, it empowers you to act on your own authority from that point of view. Why? Because you're self managed, because you built a system for yourself that has a foundation to it that will never escape you, never leave you, and help you make great decisions in situations where you can act on your own authority and feel comfortable about that. Helps you focus on key responsibilities. And there are really only a few key responsibilities when it comes to looking at self managed individuals. Okay. It increases return on energy. I'll say that again, increases return on energy, much like we want an increased return on investments. Every time we invest a dollar, if we got $1.25 back, i.e., we're making 25 cents on every dollar we invest in. And Morrow just joined us now. I know Morrow, he'd like to make that investment over and over and over and over again. Okay. Likewise, when we start to make an investment into our own self management, we get these massive returns on our energy that allows us to perform at a really high level. And the other, I'll say, benefit to the overall system, it reduces stress. Primarily why? Because you're focusing on what you can control as the individual and not focusing on the things that you can't control. And you start to take 100% responsibility for your own quote unquote performance. So, 4 simple principles to the self management system. Anybody that wants to start to, what I'll say, self manage themselves, you literally start to walk through what I'll call these 4 principles. 1, self confidence determines expectations. So let's do a baseline in terms of where our self confidence is right now. We're going to do that in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And then from there, where do we want to build our self confidence? How far do we want to build it? How do we want to build it? What does that look like from that point of view? Simply because our self confidence determines expectations. Once we start to build our self confidence and we determine what we expect of ourselves, expectations dictate performance. We will start to perform at that level that starts to drive not only the performance, but the results that we want because we've built that foundation of self confidence. And then third is true motivation is internal. Again, if you look at all highly successful people, number one competency of all highly successful people that we talked about is they're self-managed, correct? Well, a big part of self-management is self-motivation. They take responsibility for their own motivation, and motivation is internal, simply because internal motivation is always ongoing, never ending, and it's always future oriented. So you've got this wealth of what I'll say self motivation that is always going to be at your disposal, at your access. Why? Because you're the one who's manufacturing it yourself. And then the last is we're going to manage ourselves by effort that leads to performance that produces the results. We're not going to focus on the results, and you'll understand why. So let's dive into it. Okay. I like to say I'm going to walk you through what I call the self-confident model. And this is, you can do your own, what I'll say, assessment as you go through it from that point of view. So you might want to get paper and pen out. Somebody who is, what I'll say, consciously competent and consciously incompetent, that's the person right in the box number 1 there on the left-hand side. They learn from what they do well, and they learn from what they don't do well. So I like to say that individual gets what I call full learning, meaning they're very aware of what they do well, and they're very aware of what they don't do well. And because they're aware of it, they can do learning on both sides. And that's what I call a truly self confident individual. How you can identify these people is simply that: have a conversation with them, ask them what they do well. They'll very much be able to have that conversation with you and tell you what you do, what or tell you what they do well. And also then say, well, what are some of the challenge areas? What are some of the growth areas for you? They're equally comfortable on either side of that equation. As comfortable as they were to tell you what they're good at, they're equally comfortable to tell you what they're not good at, and or where there is growth opportunities from that point of view. Okay? They don't try to hide it, they don't run away from it from that point of view. Okay? Likewise too, when they talk about what they do well, they don't brag or boast about it as well too. It's a very, what I'll say, easygoing conversation where again they're equally comfortable to talk to you about what they do well and what they don't do well, and it allows them to make a choice, and I'll talk about that choice in a moment. So then box number two, okay, is the individual who's consciously competent, unconsciously incompetent. They know very well what they do well, they're not aware of what they don't do well. So learning only happens on the side of the equation of what they do well. Okay. So that's half learning. They're missing the other half of it. And somebody who learns solely from what they do well, okay, has what we call an arrogant, self confident model. Not to say they're arrogant. We're not judging people here and we're not saying they're arrogant. What I'm saying is they have an arrogant self confidence model, meaning they learn solely from what they do well. So that's where solely their focus is on. And they miss the opportunity to learn from things that they don't do well to where they can continue to grow. And by simply doing that, you start to build that self confident characteristic as opposed to just having the arrogant, what I'll say, characteristic when it comes to your self confidence. Okay. The third box, that's the individual that's what I'll say unconsciously competent, consciously incompetent. It's the opposite of the arrogant individual. They're not aware of what they do well, they're highly aware of what they don't do well. And again, that individual, half learning, because the majority of the learning comes from what they don't do well. I like to say that's a self-doubter, self-confidence. Again, we're not what I'll say judging people here. We're talking about where the self-confidence is. Because if you start to understand which one of these three or four are you, you can start to move yourself on the journey to get you up into that, what I'll say, box number one. Because ultimately, a truly self-managed individual is always in box one, highly aware of what they do well, highly aware of what they don't do well. So then the last one to finish this off is the individual who's unconsciously competent and unconsciously incompetent. That individual doesn't learn from what they do well, and they don't learn from what they don't do well. Simply put, and it's not that they're quote unquote, what I'll say, uneducated, not smart, anything else like that. It really goes to awareness. Okay. And so there's no learning happening simply because they're not aware. And so what we need to do and where we start with individuals like that is we start to build awareness. And you'll see how we'll start to do that. Okay. And here's what happens. Okay. So when we go to the next slide, now we're talking about the self confident individual, the self doubter, and the arrogance self confidence. Where again, I can't stress enough, we're not judging people here as much as we're talking about a self confident model. Because if we understand, let's go back to what we talked about, the four principles. Self confidence determines the expectations of your that you have on yourself. Okay. So if we build that truly self confident model, then we're going to build those great expectations. So, generally speaking, 90% of what we do well at. As individuals, we're pretty talented individuals from that point of view. And 90% of what we do well, leaving 10% of what we do opportunities for growth. Okay. Here's the challenge: The truly, what I'll say, self-confident individual, they spend 90% of their time on that, what I'll say, circle down on the bottom left-hand side where it says specific strengths, things they do well. That's where they spend 90% of their time. And then they spend 10% of their time over on the circle on the bottom right hand side, which are their quote unquote growth opportunities from that point of view. And that they understand their performance comes from focusing on 90% of what they do well, their strengths, and focusing 10% of their time or energy or efforts, however you want to divide it up, on what the growth opportunities are. This is why they're highly, what I'll say, successful, or I'll say highly comfortable about talking about what they do well and what their growth opportunities. And so they slide back and forth between those two, what I'll say, circles down on the bottom of the page, clearly spending 90% of the time on their specific strengths, 10% of their time on their growth opportunities. And when they go over on their growth opportunities, again, they're highly aware. So they make good decisions here. What I mean by that is, can I do this on my own, or do I want to hire a coach? Or do I want to hire a personal trainer? Do I want to interact with somebody to help me get better here? And depending on the individual situation, they might even say, you know what? Doesn't really pay me to work on that growth right now. So I'm just going to go hire somebody to actually do it for me because it's not quote unquote my strengths, which allows me to spend even more time over on my strengths. So that can be an affordability question as well too. The other side of it is wherever our strengths are now, we can always grow them. So again, these people that spend 90% of their time on their strengths are also very open to working with coaches, working with mentors, working with trainers to say, how can I get that even stronger? How can I even make that better? Okay. And if we go back to the analogy that I started earlier on with Wayne Gretzky playing for the Oilers back in the mid 80s and working with Sather, that's exactly what Sather did. Rather than focusing on Wayne Gretzky's quote unquote growth opportunities, i.e., the defensive side of the game, he really focused on the offensive side of the game with Wayne and started to understand the more that I focus on his strengths, the more I'm going to drive his performance to a higher level, to where he actually started to then double shift Wayne. And so not only did Wayne Gretzky's performance go to a higher level, but because he's double shifting him, like Gretzky being a center, he's now playing with two sets of wingers rather than one set of winger, and he's on the ice twice as much. So now he's impacting the performance of four other people rather than two other people. Because when we're a high performer and we interact with the people around us, that will cause them to bring their performance up to our level, as opposed to going down to their level. And so then the other thing that Gretzky or that Sather really saw about that was, you know what? I'm going to stick Gretzky out on the quote unquote penalty kill. Okay. Put him out on the PK. Now that's a very traditionally a defensive minded position in a hockey game because you're trying to quote unquote kill off the penalty and not give up a goal. So everybody typically would be thinking very defensively at that point. But what Sather saw was, you know what? Yeah, we're thinking defensively, but the other team's thinking offensively. And I have to neutralize that. Okay, so I'm going to put Gretzky on the PK and I'm going to put him up high on the point against their big defenseman because their big defenseman pretty much has a shot, okay, like a cannon. Back in the day, there was the big rivalry between Calgary and Edmonton, and Al McGuinness was the big shot guy back then, 105 miles an hour, 106 mile an hour slap shot. All of a sudden now with Gretzky being up at the top there, now all of a sudden McInnes has to think defensively rather than thinking offensively because he thinks, oh my gosh, if Gretzky picks my pocket, he's going the other way, and now I'm giving up a shorthanded goal. So again, where I'm going with this is Sather, being the mastermind of all of this, kept looking at how do I put Gretzky into opportunities that can focus on his strengths and grow his performance that way. Okay. So that's the, what I'll say, self-confident individual, the top performer. The arrogant self-confidence, again, not what that we're calling people arrogant, but the arrogant self-confidence, they spend 90% of their time on their strengths like the self-confident individual does. The difference here is the self-confident individual also is highly aware of what they don't do well and either gets help or goes and gets support on that 10% that they don't do well. The arrogance individual, because they're focused on the 90% of what they do well and they're not aware of what they don't do well, they take that 90% and they generalize it to 100%, saying, I'm good at everything. And so they take that 90% strength on that bottom left hand side and they generalize it up into the center ball, saying, I'm good at everything. And while they're very good at that 90%, it is costing them from that other 10%. So, what you want to do working with these kinds of individuals, if I was coaching this kind of individual, again, I would focus on their strengths and I would drive their strengths to a very high level. And given that I'm coaching them, I would coach them till I got to a point of them very much trusting me. And once they trust me, I would start to move towards, hey, you know what? There are some growth opportunities over here that could really impact your performance and impact your self-confidence to get to that to a higher level. Okay. The self-doubters, they do the opposite. They take the 10% on the growth opportunities, which is the bottom, what I'll say, right hand side ball, and they generalize that to 100 and say, I'm not good at anything. Okay. And where you can see this, again, you know me in the past, I talk a lot about sales because I love training salespeople as well, too. So this might be where a salesperson is really good at prospecting, is really good at handling objections, is really good at presentations, is really good at negotiation, for argument's sake, is really good at what I'll say, developing trust within people. And yet they might struggle with closing. They might have a hard time closing. Closing might not be their quote unquote strongest strength. And it could be even what I'll say a growth opportunity. And so because they're highly aware of what they don't do well, they're not aware of what they do well, because they struggle with closing. And you can identify this because that's what they'll always talk about. I can't close well. I'm not a very good closer. I get scared when closing comes along. And because that's the predominant, what I'll say, verbalized speech coming out of themselves, essentially what that leads to is because they're not a good closer, they literally end up saying, I'm not a good salesperson. And they start to develop a belief that they're not a good salesperson. And they focus again on the 10% of what they don't do well. So there's massive room for growth on these people from that point of view. You've got to get them aware of what's going on with their self-confidence. If I go back and flip that back to the arrogance individual, same kind of analogy, where they're good on everything in sales and growth opportunity on closing, what comes out of their, what I'll say, language is, I'm a great salesperson. I'm good at everything. And so while they might be missing some sales because of that growth opportunity on closing, they don't see it. Okay. The self-doubter, great at handling objections, great at prospecting, great at negotiation, great at presentation. They don't see that because they're not aware of it. So where I'm going with this from a self-confidence point of view, top performers focus 90% of their development efforts on leveraging their strengths and 10% of their development area efforts in areas where they're not yet fully competent. This ratio allows them to function with self-confidence. Why? Because they're spending 90% of the time on what they do well and only 10% of their time on growth opportunities. And they've got learning coming from both sides. Okay. For the business owners that are looking at this, just purely from a hiring point of view, because I always like to help business owners from a hiring point of view. If I had three candidates in front of me, one is self-confidence, one an arrogant, one a quote unquote a self-doubter from a self-confidence model. Clearly, the person I want to hire first is a self-confident model, correct? They've got both 90% on strengths, 10% on growth opportunities. Between self-doubters and arrogance, who would you typically want to hire first? A lot of people say self-doubters. You actually want to hire the arrogance second from that point of view. Why? Because they already know to spend 90% on things that they do well. And you simply have to work with them until they trust you, and then they'll go to the growth opportunity side. Working with the self-doubter, that's a tough slug because they're focused, quote unquote, 100% of their time on the 10% that they don't do well. And they're not even aware of the 90% that they do well. So that's a little harder from a developmental point of view. I'll just throw that out. Okay. So we've developed our self confidence. Our self confidence develops our expectations. Now that we've developed these really high expectations of ourselves, and this is the most powerful psychological principle there is out there, whatever people expect of themselves and others will probably happen. If you think you can, or if you think you can't, you are right. What are the expectations that you're having of yourself? And this is where I like to say to people, you get in life what you believe, not what you want. There's a lot of people who want to be a millionaire who are not millionaires. Why? Because they don't believe they can get there. An expectation is a belief, it's not a want. And so, again, as you're going through this process of self managing yourself, so you, what I'll say, act on your own authority, you've got to get really clear with yourself. And you got to get really honest with yourself in terms of what do I believe I can accomplish? What do I believe I can do? And start with where you believe, and we'll show you how that works in just a bit. Because if you think you can, you will can. I.e., if you believe you can, you will. If you believe you can't, you're going to be proved right from that point of view. So always start with where you believe you can and go there. I don't care however small, start there and then grow. Okay. And this was a very powerful, if you think you can, I think you can. You're right. It simply came from Henry Ford. And Henry Ford had a belief, i.e., had an expectation that he could develop, build, manufacture a V8 engine. Because back in those days, all the engines were straight sixes. They didn't even have fours then. Straight sixes, straight eights. Rolls-Royce had, I believe, even a straight 12, if you can believe how long the nose was on that baby. And so he believed that they could have a V8 engine that would reduce the amount of quote unquote raw material, develop the same amount of, well, say, horsepower, but in an engine compartment that took up a lot less room. And so he went to his senior engineer team and he said, I believe we can build a V8 engine. I'd like you guys to build me a couple of prototypes. Well, guess what all the senior engineers said? Can't be done, because they didn't believe it could. And so Henry Ford got a little frustrated, being the individual that he is. So he went to his junior engineer team and said, I believe we can build what I'll say a V8 engine. Guess what his junior engineer team said? Because they weren't as knowledgeable, and that's one of the challenges, they weren't as experienced. That's another, what I'll say, challenge is sometimes we get so experienced and so knowledge, we almost believe we know the answer before we even, what I'll say, apply ourselves. And so the junior engineer teams went and did it. Guess what? They developed a V8 engine. And Henry Ford, being the, I'll say, business tyrant that he is back there, fired all of his senior engineers. Okay. I'm not saying suggest you want to do that with your people if you're a business owner either. Where I'm going with it is you clearly want to understand both yourself as a self-manager, and if you are a business owner and you're leading people to become self-managed, start with where they believe. Because if you think you can, you can. If you believe you can, you can. And we see this in sports all the time. So again, the gap between where you're performing and where you want your performance expectations to go can be a very powerful motivator from that point of view, provided that the gap is what we call appropriate. And typically what I'll say is appropriate is about a 25% increase. I do a lot of work with salespeople, and we've talked about it in the last few sessions, that work in the car industry. So it's really easy. They sell X amount of cars a month. Let's assume somebody's selling, I'll say, 10 cars a month. And if they've already proved to themselves that they can sell 10 cars a month, now to sit there and set a new expectation for themselves, a new belief for themselves that they can say sell 12 to 13 cars in a month, probably realistic. And they will believe that. Again, expectations dictate performance. An expectation is a belief. They will believe that, and they'll probably go do it. Where if they tried to say, well, now I'm going to go try to sell 20 cars in a month, that expectation is too big of a gap. That's 100% what I'll say stretch. And you'll get a couple outcomes there. You'll get either people that won't even try. There's no way I can do 20 cars, so I'm not even going to try. or there's the people that will literally die trying. Why? Because that gap from where their current performance is to where they want to get to is too high. Likewise, if the gap's too low, well, now it becomes, again, a demotivator as well, too. I'm selling 10, I only want to go to 11. I can cruise half the month and still bring in the 11. And a lot of people end up getting short there. So as you're starting to manage your own expectation, wherever your level of performance is right now, wherever your quote unquote current performance is, selling whatever, achieving whatever. Funny, it just came to me. I was driving down from Edmonton this morning. I was visiting my oldest daughter up in Edmonton, and my youngest daughter called me. She's all excited. She goes for her personal best on her workout. So she's just a little short thing, kind of 5'3", 5'4", but she's kind of mighty, kind of powerful. And so she calls me in the car. She goes, "Dad, guess what? Guess where my squats were today?" And so she's all excited because she squatted, I think she said 185 pounds 5 times. And that's a new personal best. Okay. Where was she before? She was doing, I think, about 165. So again, what's an appropriate gap? She's right in that range of about 20-25%. And so as she starts to work out today, she's already got a belief in her that she believes she can do 180 pounds. She hasn't proved to it herself to it yet, but she's already got the belief. So now when it comes time to actually perform at the new higher expectation level, guess what? The belief is there. So guess what she does? She goes and does it. And now she's got a new quote unquote current performance level at 180 pounds. So again, where's she going to go? I'll say in the next week or the next 2 weeks. Clearly, she's going over the 200. And you can literally stair step your performance this way over and over and over again. Right? And here's simply what happens. Again, this is where self-confidence determines your expectations, and then expectations dictate your performance. Again, the moment you become consciously competent about something, you become more aware of something, you start to drive your self-confidence to a higher level. The moment you start to drive your self-confidence to a higher level, you start to drive the expectations that you have of yourself, i.e. the beliefs in yourself, to a higher level. And the moment you start to drive your expectations to a higher level of yourself, your performance goes to a higher level. And as your performance goes to a higher level, guess what happens to your results? We're not even there yet. They go to a higher level. So this is the whole thing about how the first principle of self-confidence determines your expectations. Expectations dictate your performance. That's how those two models or those two principles tie together. Okay, let's go into the third one then from that point of view. And I'm going to stand up again because my knees bothered me a little bit here. Okay. And this is, if we can think of the first two in terms of around self-confidence, let's assume we're building a supercar here. Let's go. I always like the Lamborghini. So we're building a supercar Lamborghini. I've always been partial to the orange ones too. So this is an orange one with black leather interior, orange piping, really nice. Okay. And so we're building a supercar Lamborghini here. The first two around self-confidence determines expectations and expectations dictate performance. Think of those as we're building the engine. And most Lamborghinis have these amazing V10 and V12 engines that produce over 500, 600 horsepower. So we're building this amazing supercar that has this amazing super engine in it, which are what I'll say the first two principles. Now we come to the third one. The third principle is motivation. Think of motivation as the gas that you're going to put into that supercar. Well, you'd want to put high octane gas into that and not diesel, because if you put diesel in, not going to run well. If you put that high octane in, it's going to run well. So let's really start to understand what I'll call true motivation being internal. Okay. So we've got two types of motivation. Avoidance, that's the push motivator on the left-hand side of the slide, and quote unquote, the approach motivation, or what we call the pull, meaning a push motivator is something that I want to avoid, because if I let something happen, I'm going to get what I'll say hit with the stick, punished in some respects. Okay. And so a push motivator is what I'll call a negative, or what I'll say a painful motivator, if you want to call that. Okay. And so I push myself to do something to avoid the pain. The other is what we call a pull motivator, which is the success or the attraction or the pleasure. And so I pull myself to go do that because I want to achieve whatever that success is. I want to achieve whatever that pleasure is. Okay. And here's the key thing about motivation. Think of it like that rubber band, that what I'll say circle in the middle around comfort zone. Okay. So think of it as a rubber band. When I push two ends together as a rubber band and I let it go, it goes back to original shape. So if I was going to push those two ends together of that orange circle around the word comfort zone and I let it go and it's a rubber band, it would spring back to its original shape, meaning it springs back to my comfort zone. And if I pull it from that point of view and let it go, it goes back to original shape, going back to my comfort zone. Here's the difference between internal and external motivation. External is something outside of me impacting on me. If I was working with Morrow, for argument's sake, because they know he's on the call right now, and he was giving me a push motivator. Bruce, if you don't do this, I'm going to hit you with this stick. Bruce, if you do this, I'm going to hit you with that stick. Okay. Those are an external push motivators. So I go do whatever I have to do to avoid getting hit with the stick. Because it's external, the moment I do what I needed to do to avoid getting hit with the stick, I stop because it's external. Likewise, if Morrow says, Bruce, I will give you this if you go do this, or I will give you that if you stop doing that, the moment I go do whatever it is to get that reward, the motivation stops because it's external. And Morrow gives me, quote unquote, whatever I want. But the motivation stops. Why? Because it's external. When motivation becomes internal, meaning I'm the one supplying both the push and the pull, now it is everlasting, lifelong, and future oriented because it's always dealing with something in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Because here's the key thing. You want to focus no more than 10% of your motivation on a push motivator. And here's why. A push motivator, which is the negative, a push motivator, which is the painful, okay, motivates us 10 times more than something on the pull motivator of the same accordance. Okay, why? Because we like to avoid pain. Our brains are hardwired to avoid pain. And so a well timed push motivator will motivate somebody much more than the same, what I'll say accordingly, pull motivator. But here's the challenge. If I constantly motivate myself on the push side, I'm going to burn myself out because it's not sustainable. I can only take that level of intensity. I can only take that level of pain for so long. So while I do want to get focused on some really good, what I'll say, push motivators, if we're talking about, again, the motivation being the fuel that goes into the supercar engine, about 10% of my fuel I want to make up from my push motivator. 90% I want to make up from my pull motivator. So when I was working with salespeople and we were getting them into high and top success, I would always say, you want to go home each and every day and celebrate your successes. That's the pull motivator when you have the day you want. And so they go home and they reinforce themselves each and every day by going and doing something that they really wanted. Also, though, if you don't, quote unquote, perform at the level that you want, what's something you're going to take away from you? What's something that you're going to miss? Okay. And back in the day when I was, I'll say, growing my business and working out, and I still do this today, some respects, people think I'm a little crazy, but when it comes into performance and your goals, OCD is really good. If I haven't performed at my level, my expectation level of my own performance from that point of view, I'll probably skip a meal. I'll probably skip dinner. And if you know me, I like my food. And so why? Because by quote unquote going to bed hungry, I know, and that feeling of hunger, I know that I didn't perform my best today. And so it motivates me to quote unquote get back into my best performance the next day. Again, I only do that about 10% of the time because if you know me, I like my food. So I'm going to, what I'll say, pull myself into success and pull myself to a higher level of performance. Why? Because I want to eat. And I really do like eating. Like today, we've had a good week here. We've had a good week here at Give to Get. We've had a good week at a number of different things from that point of view. So as soon as I finish here, I'm going to start to prepare a steak, Caesar salad, shrimp cocktail with a beautiful bottle of wine meal for my wife tonight. Why? Because we performed well and we do deserve it. That's the 90% on the pull side. And so start to set up these, what I'll say, internal challenges for yourself around motivation when it comes to, quote unquote, the push motivator, only about 10% of the time, and it's got to be painful. And then the pull motivator, 90% of the time, and it's got to be really good, something that you really want to, what I'll say, celebrate yourself with, and or what I'll say, share with your family. So again, true motivation is internal. The last one that can help you around motivation, start to ask yourself a series of questions. How do I feel about ... And I always like to say, tie it to performance. Like we talked about earlier, performance is your talent times your habits times the opportunity that you're working on. How do I feel about my performance with, how do I feel about this? Mara and I were having a conversation even just at the beginning of the week about how I felt about my performance on the Give to Get program. And in some areas, I've been performing really well. In other areas, I haven't. And so, again, I need to, what I'll say, be self aware of that. My self confidence, I need to be equally talking about what I do well and what I don't do well. What are my strengths? What are my growth opportunities? And Laura and I had a good conversation about that in terms of, what's going really well with the program. Keep doing that to a higher level. What are the things, the growth opportunities that we need to do? And that again is my personal responsibility. Why? Because I personally self-manage myself, just like you personally self-manage yourself. So how do you feel about your performance about? Next is, what would I like to accomplish? And I always like to say, here, put a timeline on it. What would I like to accomplish in the next day? What would I like to accomplish in the next week? What I'd like to accomplish in the next month? What I'd like to accomplish in the next 6 months? Again, I'm going to go back and cite Morrow because Morrow and I have been working together on his other business. And we literally done this in and around what I'll say his financial numbers. And we've been doing it for about a year now. And what's happened to his numbers? One, they've gotten better all the way across the board. Why? Because Morrow's constantly assessing about how he feels about his performance with respect to the numbers. And he's the CEO, so he's responsible for that. And what would he like to accomplish? And away we go. Setting targets, setting deadlines. Okay. What do I need to do? So how do I feel about my performance? What would I like to accomplish in the next timeline? What do I need to do in order to make that happen? Now we're starting to really get into driving expectations based on your self-confidence and what you believe you can do. Because again, you get in life what you believe, not what you want. And then what will I go do? And this is critical because here's the difference. A lot of people say, I want to go do this. Okay. When people say, I want to go do that, that's not a commitment. When people say, I will go do that, that's now a commitment. And there's a different trigger that goes off in the head when you say to yourself, I will go do that. So how do I feel about my performance? What would I like to accomplish in the next month? What do I need to do in order to get there? What will I do? What will I commit to? And what help will I need? Will I need Morrow's help? Will I need Mike's help? Will I need some of our coaches' help? Will I need some of our members' help? What help will I need? Start to identify where you can go get that help. And then again, not only what help will I need, but where can I go get that help? Okay. All of these questions, by walking yourself through this process, can help you, what I'll say, develop your own self-motivation to help self-manage yourself and your performance at a higher level. Okay. So now we want to start to manage ourselves by effort, not by results. How come? Why would I say if we manage ourselves by objectives and manage ourselves by results, what you're really doing is managing yourself by crisis, meaning you're going the wrong way on a one-way street. One, we can't control results. Okay, there's way too many variables. We can only control our effort. That's why you see effort on the far left-hand side of the page. It's 100% controllable. The R, which represents the results on the right-hand side of the page, can't control that. And so when I focus on achieving results, I'm actually going the wrong way on a one-way street. So let's stop what I'll say focusing and managing ourselves by effort, by results, start to manage ourselves by effort. You'll see how this works. So, okay, the big arrow up at top represents what I'll say our process of getting to where we want to achieve. And the arrow is pointing to the results that we want down the road. If I'm going to put in a quantity of effort, which I quote unquote determine because it's my effort, so I can put in the quantity of effort that's 100% controllable on my side. Okay. I can then look by going through those series of questions that we just asked and by working with a coach. This is why it's so valuable to work with great coaches, because they can help on the quality of effort, get you to a higher level of ability faster and faster and faster, so that I start to produce what I'll say greater performance that leads to greater results. Because each time I put in a quantity of effort and then I work with a coach and my quality of effort gets better, I'm going to bounce back a few slides here. Guess what? My conscious confidence just went to a higher level, which means my self-confidence just went to a higher level, which means my expectation just went to a higher level, which means my performance just went to a higher level. And so again, what can I go do? I'm going to bounce back here to this one again. Now I can go in the second time and I can put in a higher quantity of effort. And likewise, once I put the quantity of effort in, I'm going to produce some sort of result working with my coach. I can continue to improve and become more consciously competent, which means I become more self-confident, which means I have a higher expectation of myself, which means I have a higher expectation of my performance of myself. I start to produce more results, and I can go back a third time. And so you get this cyclical effect of higher quantity of effort, do the learning, higher quality of effort, go back and put in a higher quantity of effort, and repeat the process. Okay. Again, 100% control on the quantity of my effort. And that's all I want to start with. As I do that, I start to influence my performance and my results on the percentage on the far right-hand side to a much higher degree. Okay. It's a wonderful process to start to take yourself through. And what you'll end up doing is developing a system for yourself of how to self-manage yourself. Okay. So here's some self-coaching questions. How did that go? I just went through this process right now, put in the quantity of effort, worked with my coach, went to a higher quality of effort. How did it go? What went well? How good was my preparation? What would I do differently if I was to go back and do that again? What are my next steps to go do that again? And that's again how I can start to self-coach myself and or with working with a good coach to a higher level of what I'll say quality of effort. Okay. So I want to go through a few things here just to help you, what I'll say, encapsulate this as we wrap up in the last 5 minutes. Again, winners act on their own authority. Winners act on their own authority because why? They're self-managed. It's as simple as that. So start to self-manage yourself, start to act on your own authority. Okay. How do we do that? One, winners determine their own goals. Okay. They don't work with company goals or anybody else's goals. They work with their own goals. Okay. They select their own behaviors and attitudes. That's a constant choice that they make on their own, nobody else. Okay. They establish mission tickets to themselves, meaning they hold themselves accountable to certain things, and then they don't get to go do things unless they've paid the price of admission, which is the quantity of effort. If I was wanting to fly back to Ontario right now to go see Morrow, I need an airline ticket to get on the plane and probably wear a mask. If I didn't have the ticket, I'm not getting on the plane. In order to get the ticket, I've got to put a level of effort in to go earn that income to go buy that ticket. Start to establish admission tickets to yourself and hold yourself accountable. And if you've held yourself accountable and you've, what I'll say, paid the price, go reward yourself. If you haven't, take something away and get back on it. Okay? Keep your commitments to yourself. Self reinforce any action, attitude, or behavior, positive or negative, that's reinforced will persist. Self reinforce what you want to persist. Evaluate your own performance honestly and effectively after each time through that chart we went through. Evaluate your results, same thing. Self assess your skills and development for needs. And always self assess your skill development and where you need to go. Again, though, 90% on your strengths, 10% on your growth. And then evaluate your overall progress based on performance that leads to results, based on turning your potential into results. Okay? And then to put it all together, I want a couple things that I want to put in front of you. Okay? Never get so busy making a living that you forget to make a life. Everything that we're doing here to drive performance is all around making a life for ourselves, making a life for our family, making a life for your significant other, making a life for your children. So never get so busy that you're so busy doing that you forget to quote unquote make a life for yourself. And how do we do that? By making self commitments and keeping them. You want to be in that middle range of being self committed. There are some people out there that are highly selfish and they're not self managed. There are some people out there that are selfless, running around doing a whole lot of things for other people. They're not self managed either, though. Okay. One is being very selfish and not getting themselves to a highest level. One is being very selfish and running all over the place and feeling like they've got no control in their life. How do you do that? By keeping your self commitments to yourself. And then the last one I like to walk through here is, again, a lifestyle simple plan. Okay. Again, you've got your job, your career, you're going to spend about 80% of the time there. That's very traditional. You can't get away from that. Okay. We're always going to spend more time on our jobs than with our family, with our loved ones. This is where I like to say, take work-life balance and throw it out. I'm more what I'll say focused on priority balance rather than what I'll say work-life balance or time balance. Okay. Family and friends, we're probably going to spend about 15% of the time and about 5% on ourselves. And because we inordinately spend the time breakdown there, traditionally in our mind, we very much prioritize work number one, family number two, and self number three in our mind. Yet we can't go say that to our families, and we want them to be quote unquote number one, but we put ourselves into this conflict. This is where I like to say, when you're spending that 80% of the time with your career, prioritize it number one and let both your family know and your friends know that that's number one. When you're spending the 15% of your time with family and friends, make that priority number one and let your job know and let yourself know that that takes precedence. And then when you're spending the quote unquote 5% on yourself, that's priority number one. Let your job know, let your career know, let your family know, let your friends know, hey, this is me time. And this is my priority number one in that moment. Okay. It's about being proactive around the quality of time that you're investing in your self management system versus being reactive and in survival mode. Okay. Any questions on that? I'll stop sharing now and I'll sit back down in my chair because presentation's over and my knee actually feels better. Any questions or comments before we let everybody go on with their weekend? Okay, then. Everybody have a wonderful weekend with your family. Sincere wishes from us to what I'll say, all of you people, all of the members that Give to Get. We are building a momentum. We are building a movement here. We're having a lot of fun from that point of view. Thank you for being members. And as I've been saying to everybody the last little bit, it's going to be really fun, really exciting, and really dynamic when we look back on this 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and where we are and what we're doing. So, one, thank you very much for that. We've always got new things coming. We'll always be planning new things from that point of view. Continue to reach out and let us know. We're going to continue to, what I'll say, reach out to you and re-engage you at different levels as well to make this all take off. And I'm just excited to do that. So have a great weekend, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.